somewhere in eastern Ukraine. The autumn of 1942. A German soldier sits down and writes a letter home. He misses his wife. He asks about the harvest. He complains about the mud. The autumn rains have turned every road into a brown swamp, and the supply trucks haven't come through in 4 days. He signs off with love, folds the paper, and hands it to the field post. That same week, his unit shot 100 civilians in reprisal for a partisan attack on a supply column. Army policy, a written order signed by Field Marshal Keitel the year before. 50 to 100 civilians for every German soldier killed, the exact number left to the local commander's discretion. He doesn't mention it in the letter. A scene like this played out thousands of times that autumn. Different villages, different ratios, the same silence in the field post. Across the entire Eastern Front, 5.7 million Soviet soldiers would pass through German captivity before the war ended. 3.3 million of them were dead by the time it was over, not killed in battle, not executed by firing squad, but deliberately starved. The Wehrmacht's legal department had ruled that the Geneva Convention didn't apply to Soviet prisoners because the Soviet Union hadn't signed it. Moscow offered to observe the convention anyway. Berlin declined the offer. Rations were set below survival level on purpose. The Red Cross was denied access. Men ate grass, ate leather, even ate each other. 17 million soldiers. Nobody ever put them on the stand and asked, did they fight for Lebensraum and the destruction of Bolshevism, to finish what 1918 left unfinished, or were they just men who answered when their country called? None of those answers are wrong. That's the problem. You've probably already heard the answer. Most of them were ordinary men. They weren't fighting for Hitler. They were fighting for Germany, for the family back home, for the soldier in the foxhole next to them. Products of their time. Victims, in their own way, of a regime they hadn't chosen and couldn't escape. This is the version that post-war Germany needed. It is also defensible, and it held because it wasn't entirely false. The young Bavarian smith's apprentice who volunteered, 17 years old, not political, just a kid who'd watched soldiers come home with medals and wanted to be part of something larger than a forge, that man existed. He wasn't a fanatic. He was a young man doing what young men have done in every war in history. There was nothing National Socialist about wanting a uniform, and the letters bear this out. Some 30 billion letters circulated between the Wehrmacht and the German home front between 1939 and 1945. What soldiers wrote about, overwhelmingly, was what soldiers always write about. Food, weather, exhaustion, missing the people they loved. The same letters a British soldier sent from the Somme or an American sent from the Pacific. So far, so human. In 1948, 2 American sociologists named Edward Shills and Morris Janowitz published what became the most influential explanation for German military effectiveness in the Second World War. Their argument was simple and, for 4 decades, almost universally accepted. German soldiers fought, they argued, because of primary group loyalty, the bond between men in a small unit. Ideology was irrelevant. What kept a soldier in the line wasn't belief in National Socialism. It was the man to his left and the man to his right. Then Omer Bartov read the casualty records. Bartov, an Israeli historian working from Heer divisional archives, found something the Shills-Janowitz theory couldn't explain. On the Eastern Front, German divisions were taking casualty rates so catastrophic that primary groups had ceased to exist. The divisions Bartov studied had replaced their entire manpower several times over by 1943. And they were typical, not exceptional. The men in a typical frontline unit in the last 2 years of the war had in most cases never served together before. There were no old friendships to protect. There were no bonds forged in training camps. The mates that soldiers were supposedly fighting for didn't exist as a stable social unit. The theory depended on relationships the Eastern Front had already destroyed. If the friendships were gone, then what replaced them? Before we get into that, if you're finding this interesting, a like and a subscribe is what keeps this channel running. Now back to it. Something else was holding those men in the field. Part of it was terror. The Wehrmacht sentenced some 30,000 of its own soldiers to death and carried out more than 20,000 of those sentences, at least 15,000 of them for desertion. Imperial Germany had executed fewer than 100 in the entirety of the First World War. The United States convicted over 21,000 men of desertion and executed exactly one: Private Eddie Slovic. Britain had abolished the death penalty for desertion entirely. But coercion alone doesn't build an offensive army. Fear can hold a line. It can't take a hill. Something was pulling those men forward, and it wasn't the threat of a court-martial. Stephen Fritz went into the same letters everyone had been mining for normality, and came out with the opposite reading. Ideology pulled, and some soldiers went looking for it. The Volksgemeinschaft, the Nazi ideal of a classless people's community, was one of the most attractive promises of the regime, and soldiers believed in it with a sincerity that post-war Germany found embarrassing to admit. At the front, class evaporated under artillery. Officers and enlisted men shared the same mud, the same rations, the same cold. For men who had grown up in the stratified wreckage of Weimar Germany, where your father's trade determined your entire horizon, that was lived experience. His name was Karl Fuchs, a schoolteacher in training from Franconia, a tank gunner in the 7th Panzer Division. By every measure, one of the ordinary men the post-war story was built around. His letters home from Russia in 1941 don't read like a man enduring a war. They read like a man confirming a worldview. The poverty he saw, the devastation, the scale of Soviet misery. Fuchs wrote home that it proved everything he'd been told, that these people needed Germany to bring them order. He was killed outside Moscow that November, still believing it. He was 24. Fritz found men like Fuchs throughout the Feldpost, soldiers who entered the war skeptical and emerged from the Eastern Front as converts. Russia was where the ideology stopped being abstract. They were fighting for something real, they thought, and against something real. Then there's the problem of what soldiers said when they thought no one was listening. Between 1940 and 1945, British and American intelligence wired the holding cells of German POW camps with hidden microphones. The prisoners talked freely about the war, about their commanders, about what they'd seen and done. When the historian Sönke Neitzel found those transcripts in the British National Archives in 2001, they amounted to tens of thousands of pages in Britain alone, eventually totaling 150,000 pages across British and American archives. German soldiers speaking candidly to each other. No interrogator in the room, no memoir to polish, no post-war guilt to manage. Hitler almost never came up. The Reich's racial mission almost never came up. What dominated the conversations constantly, almost obsessively, was performance, tactics, the quality of their equipment against the enemies, whether their unit had handled a situation correctly. One Luftwaffe pilot, a man named Pohl, traced his own progression for a cellmate. On the second day of the Polish campaign, he bombed a railway station at Posen, and 8 of his 16 bombs missed, falling into the town among the houses. He didn't like that. By the 3rd day, he didn't care. By the 4th, his words, he was enjoying it. Chasing single soldiers across the fields with machine gun fire had become, as he put it, a before-breakfast amusement. He described all of it the way a man describes getting used to a new job. They talked about war, the way skilled tradesmen talk about their work, professional pride in execution, almost no reflection on what the work was actually for. When they did discuss massacres or the shooting of civilians, they discussed it in the same flat, operational tone they used for everything else. And here the historians themselves split. Bartov read the divisional records and concluded ideology held the Eastern Front together. Neitzel read the transcripts and concluded the war itself did, that soldiering, not National Socialism, was the frame these men lived inside. Both were reading the same army. Keep that disagreement in mind, because there's a variable neither side controlled for, where a soldier was sent mattered more than what he believed. Take two soldiers, same country, uniform, and year. One serves in France, the other serves in Russia. By the end of the war, they have fought in different moral universes, not because of who they were, but because of where they were sent. On the Western Front, in France, Italy, North Africa, the rules of war were broadly observed. Prisoners were taken. Civilian populations were not systematically targeted. A German soldier serving in France could go home and tell his children he had fought honorably. And in the narrow military sense, he might even have been right. There were massacres in the West, Oradour-sur-Glane among them. But they were crimes within the system. In the East, the crimes were the system. On the Eastern Front, the orders were different before the first shot was fired. Before the invasion of the Soviet Union, German commanders handed their men a written directive. Soviet political officers, commissars, were to be executed immediately on capture. No interrogation, no processing. This was called the Commissar Order, and it was followed, with exceptions, across the length of the Eastern Front. The Hunger Plan, the deliberate starvation of 3.3 million prisoners, was Wehrmacht policy. The reprisal ratios, the same arithmetic the letter writer in eastern Ukraine didn't mention to his wife, were Wehrmacht policy. The transport infrastructure that moved deportation trains across occupied Europe ran with German army logistical cooperation. The soldier in France never received an order like the Commissar Order. The soldier in Russia had it read to him before he crossed the border. One could maintain the fiction of honorable war because his theatre allowed it. The other was embedded from the first week of Barbarossa in a system of institutionalized mass death, whether he personally pulled a trigger at a civilian or not. And the great majority of the Heer, the regular German army, the ordinary men this entire debate is about, served in the East. In 1945, Allied officers sat captured German soldiers in front of a screen and showed them film from the camps. Rows of men, some staring at the floor, some covering their faces with both hands, some looking anywhere but forward. The standard response was shock, then denial, then claims of ignorance. For decades, historians took the soldiers at their word. The clean Wehrmacht narrative, the story of an honorable professional army untouched by Nazi criminality, was assumed to be a post-war construction. Guilt management, old men cleaning up their records before the grandchildren asked questions. David Harrisville went looking for when it actually started. He read the letters with a different question. Not what soldiers remembered after 1945, but what they were writing in 1942. Harrisville's work, published in 2021, found that German soldiers' letters from 1941 through 1944 show them actively constructing their self-image as decent men fighting a righteous cause, while the atrocities were happening. They wrote home describing themselves as generous occupiers. They framed civilian casualties as the unavoidable consequences of partisan warfare. They positioned themselves as the bringers of order to a chaotic and grateful population, even as regular Heer infantry divisions were carrying out mass reprisal executions in Serbian towns. The moral insulation wasn't built after the war, it was built during it, in real time, in the same letters that talked about missing the harvest and complaining about the mud. The men writing those letters had already performed the internal accounting that made the contradiction livable. They hadn't suppressed what they knew. They had decided that what they knew didn't constitute the kind of thing you wrote home about, that accounting had one weak point. It only held if saying no was impossible. A historian named David Kitterman tracked down more than 85 documented cases of German soldiers who refused direct orders to kill Jews, prisoners of war, or civilian hostages. He wanted to know what happened to them. None were executed. They were beaten, threatened, reassigned to the worst sectors of the worst fronts, socially destroyed inside their units. About 1 in 6 faced explicit threats of being sent to a concentration camp or the harshest front lines. But none of them were shot for saying no. That distinction matters because "they would have killed me" became the standard defense at post-war trials. Archival research has found no documented case of a German soldier executed solely for refusing to participate in civilian executions. The defense was convenient. It was also, in almost every case, a lie. The exit door existed. It was narrow, and walking through it carried a cost most men were unwilling to pay. Christopher Browning's study of Reserve Police Battalion 101 is the closest empirical window available into how ordinary institutional violence actually operates, a paramilitary unit, but the behavioral dynamics translate. Browning found that only somewhere between 10 and 20% of the men found ways to refuse or evade the killing orders. The remaining 80 to 90% complied, not because they were fanatics, but because everyone around them was complying, and the social cost of not complying was unbearable. Browning titled his study "Ordinary Men." He meant it literally. 17 million men passed through the German army. They had different reasons, different theaters, different degrees of knowing. The transcripts suggest most of them never resolved the question this video asks. They talked about the work endlessly and almost never about what the work was for. But the institution they served didn't distinguish between them, and neither does the archive. So here's the question. Were they morally responsible for the system their service sustained, even when they personally committed no atrocities? Or does moral responsibility require individual action and not merely institutional membership? Leave your answer below. If this changed how you think about the Wehrmacht, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.